Okay, we're going to get started here in just a minute, everyone. I'm going to do some quick introductions. If you're new to any of these trainings, my name is Emily Kaiser, and I am the Communications Associate here at the St. Louis Community Foundation. Also, if you could please mute yourselves, that would be great, just so there's no extra noise or feedback. I have Neosha Franklin here with me today. She is the Director of Marketing at the St. Louis Community Foundation. And today's training will be about writing a winning grant 101. We have our community investment team here today, which is Elizabeth George, who is the Director of Community Investment, and Nikki Martinez, who is Community Investment Manager. So they're going to talk to us about writing a winning grant, and I will let them take it away.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you. And just to level set for this morning, today's training is Writing a Winning Grant 101. This is sort of a beginner's or review for those of you who are more experienced. So keep that in mind as we run through our training today. So we are starting with a brief statement about grant writing. So Nikki's in charge of slides. So Nikki, next slide. And this was something I read a long time ago. I have no idea where it came from, but I think it's fairly accurate that grant writing is a creative, often frustrating, never ending, sometimes rewarding, and occasionally even fun process. Kind of like doing the laundry, right? So just sort of keep that in mind as we think about today's topic of grant writing. That it's just something that we can always get better at. That is a part of our lives, and that on occasion even can be fun. So we are going to start very briefly with a recap of who we are at the St. Louis Community Foundation, and Nikki's going to do that.
I'm unmuted. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're really excited to talk to you a little bit more about what grant making means here at the Community Foundation. So just a little overview. The Community Foundation's mission is to inspire purposeful philanthropy that connects community and donors to build and preserve a more equitable and vibrant region now and forever. I think that this is really important because it highlights both our key constituents here, which is the community, which is our Elizabeth and I, our community facing, and then our donors, which is why we are here and how we are able to do this grant making. So I think that's really important. And I also think it's really important to keep this mission in mind as we're moving forward, because we're donor led and our donors come to us with their ideas, and we are here to sort of guide them through that process. And we don't necessarily have a ton of influence sometimes, except for, terms of the process and how that looks. So sort of things to keep in mind. In 2020, these are some great stats. St. Louis Community Foundation did $119 million granted to 2,300 nonprofits and 758 individuals. So we had, that's another example of things that are donor-led. Was at the beginning of the pandemic, one of our donors came to us and said, we want to support waitresses and bartenders who are losing their jobs right now. And that's where many of those 758 individuals came in, because very quickly we were able to mobilize and put together a fund, because that was the donor intent and the driver for that process. We had 5 key partnerships and initiatives and 8 competitive grant programs. And we're going to talk about each one of those individually. So these are our grant programs, and you'll see some of them are highlighted in green, which means that they are currently open, which is very exciting. We're super excited about the Black Communities Investment Initiative. This came together through some very generous funding from Facebook. They're investing in 20 communities around the country, $20 million, $1 million for each community. And then our COVID-19 Advisory Council also committed some funds to this, so that we're able to invest in organizations that serve Black communities, and also organizations that are Black led, which we know that they have been disproportionately affected during the pandemic. We're really excited about this because it offers some capacity building opportunities and an opportunity to apply for capacity building dollars as well as general operating dollars. The Bridgeton Landfill Community Project Fund, we're not currently accepting applications, but that's been a very labor of love for Elizabeth for the past several years. That is a time-sensitive grant, so we had to have the funds out, or have to have the funds out on a certain time frame. And Elizabeth worked really hard to make sure that those funds, which came out of the court settlement, were really going towards the health, the mental health, and the environmental betterment of that community. So there's been several different grant initiatives that have come through that, and all have been really successful, and we're continuing to follow them. So I'm sure you see many of them in the news. The Charles Foundation, that is very, very focused on older adults aging in place, whether that be in their own homes or in assisted living facilities, and very specifically for South City and South St. Louis. We're happy to offer more background on any of these funds so that you know why they're so specific at any time, but today we're just giving a little overview. The Chiron Fund also open now. This is a really interesting fund because these are fairly new donors. They are anonymous, and they have several impact areas that are very important to them, but are very hyper-focused on quality mental health services. And I can't emphasize enough how important quality is to these individuals. They themselves, as the donors and the committee they've put together, are very knowledgeable about nonprofits and programming, and it's an exciting fund for us to work on. The COVID-19 Regional Response Fund, this kind of came together very organically because of the pandemic. Very quickly, we decided that we were meant to convene organizations and foundations together. This is a pooled fund of a coat of many colors, so to speak. Many donors from around our community and around the country came together to put this almost $7 million, about $6.7 million fund together. And it's kind of come full circle. We've gone from doing buying masks and providing education on wearing masks to vaccine distribution and education. The Gateway Regional Environment Fund also open now. Those grants are focused on mitigating your carbon footprint, either as an individual, whether the organization is targeting individuals' carbon footprint, or the organization as a whole. This is an interesting one for us because we don't have, as you see from some of these others, a lot of environmental grants, and this one's very different to read, which we've really enjoyed. The Guy B. Jaffe and Judy Schwartz Jaffe Charitable Foundation. That is a mouthful, and we do refer to it often as the Jaffe Charitable Foundation. This is also a new grant. Donors that for the first time are wading into competitive grant making, and we're really excited to do so. And they're really hyper focused on job creation, entrepreneurship, and then cultural arts as well. And those don't necessarily have to blend together, but I think this is such an interesting, such a good example of a fund that's a couple coming together and their impact areas and the things that are important to them coming together. The Spirit of St. Louis Women's Fund, also a really interesting fund for us. We are sort of very much on the background here. This is managed by over 100 volunteers, women in the community who are philanthropically minded and who contribute to this fund every single month so that they can do grant making at the end of the year. They have a pretty long process that involves site visits, a letter of interest, an application, and also site visits. They usually begin in September, and I encourage everybody to look at their website. I always say about this fund, if they get a lot of applications, and obviously they can't fund everyone, they are only able to fund maybe 1/10 of what they get, but it's such a great opportunity to get your organization in front of women in the community that are philanthropically minded. And they're also very focused on meeting the needs of small nonprofits, which is a little more unique. These are the private foundations and corporate grant programs. So what these are is that we don't manage this money or hold the money here at the foundation, but we provide administrative and grant making services in the background. The Burgess Family Foundation is a very large family foundation that does giving in youth empowerment, STEM, Our Heroes, which is veterans and first responders, and then also cultural arts. The BJC Gives Back program is really fun for us. This is led by BJC employees, and they essentially nominate organizations to receive small grants. They're all less than $5,000, and they like to give quite a few different grants. And they like to focus on small, very local organizations that reach the BJC region. These are fun to read because the nominators are very passionate about the organizations that they brought forward. The Episcopal Presbyterian Health Foundation, which we refer to as EPHT because it's also a mouthful. This is a rolling application process. So they accept applications on 3 separate deadlines for the first, second, and third quarter. And this is focused on health and mental health in the community, and specifically in the city of St. Louis and those sort of like inner ring suburbs. They again are very focused on those direct health and mental health services and access to those services. So they will fund things like the actual clinical services or transportation to them. The Pettis Foundation, another family foundation that has some deep roots in the St. Louis community. They work within the education and youth and entrepreneurship fields. And they are a lot of fun to work with because we like to say that they're our information gatherers. So anything that any information that they are presented about an organization, they will read it and they will take all of those factors into consideration. And they're very excited to get to know the organizations that we work with. And then finally, the Webster Groves Presbyterian Church. This is a smaller grant program that does a few targeted grants in the community each year. And they are in the second year of a 2-year funding cycle with 4 different organizations. We've added a lot of cartoons in here, and we think these are very appropriate. So hopefully it's a good humor this morning. So our funding sources, Elizabeth will talk a little bit more about our funding sources.
Nikki, can you pop back one more slide? So one of the things we did want to tell you a little bit about is the role that we play in our grant making. And so because for each type of grant program, we play a slightly different role. With the private foundations, we are the front face for those trustees. You know, they're not our donors, we don't hold those funds, but we are their grant administrators. So we meet with nonprofits. We present those nonprofits that meet their criteria, the trustees' criteria or the foundation's criteria to the trustees, and we facilitate the grant process. We accept the applications through our grant portal, we prepare the applications for decision making by the trustees, and we communicate with the nonprofits regarding decisions, both when you're awarded and when unfortunately you are not. And lastly, for private foundations, we ensure that reporting requirements are met. And then with our individual donors, oftentimes we're helping them define their charitable interests. So that was the role that we played with the Jaffe Foundation that Nikki mentioned has some real different kinds of interests there. We determine what kind of grant program they want, whether they want an open program, a targeted program, sort of a hybrid, what we lovingly call GREF, the Gateway Regional Environment Fund is doing, sending the request for proposal to some organizations that they know, but it's also an open process for organizations that they don't know to apply as well. And then, we go through that whole process of accepting the applications, prepping them for review, facilitating that decision-making, communicating, tracking, reporting, all that good stuff. And for some of these, we are protecting the donor's anonymity as well. And then lastly, for our grant programs like Bridgeton or COVID or the Black Communities Investment Initiative, those programs, we are doing the program development, the program design. That might, in all three of those cases, has included a needs assessment. And more we're using community-based grants committees or councils to help us with decisions. There's a question in the chat asking if grants require a full audit of how funds were used on the back end. And what I would say is most of our grant programs ask for an audit, and in the grant reporting, we ask for a budget, like we ask how you actually use the funds. But we'll come back to that when we talk about reporting at the end, okay? And any grants for kids with special needs, the kids with special needs, depending on what the focus is, could fall under Episcopal Presbyterian Health Trust, could fall under Pettis Foundation, could fall under Burgess Foundation, although they don't really do a lot with special needs. The other thing is the the Black Communities Investment Initiative. There it is less about the specifics of the population, other than that it is that you're working with Black communities, and more about working with Black communities in organizations led by Black CEOs or board chairs. So if an organization that works with kids with special needs fits those criteria, then that organization can apply. Okay, so let's go on and talk a little bit about grant making in general and where funding comes from. So go to that next slide. Okay, so one of the things that's really important to remember is that grants don't just come from foundations and corporations. And in fact, foundations and corporations don't make up a particularly large percentage of grants. In 2019, and I think we have to say that 2020 was a different year, and we don't know yet exactly how numbers are going to fall out for 2020. The pandemic threw a lot of things up in the air, and we'll see how that falls out. 2019, however, was fairly typical for what we have seen over the last 15 or 20 years, which is individual giving is still the primary source for funding, right, for nonprofits. And last year, or I'm sorry, 2019, that was 69%. More than 2/3. And if you add bequests, which is the little part of the pie chart, then we're really talking about 78%. And bequests come from individuals. They just are coming at a different time. And so, that giving continues to grow. It was up 2.8% in 2019 over 2018, that individual giving. And bequests were down a little bit, and without really knowing the reasons why, my assumption is that more and more people are giving while they're living, rather than putting funds into giving while they're living instead of putting it into their wills. Corporations were up in 2019 over 2018, and that'll be really interesting to see what happens in 2020. We know that there are some corporations like Enterprise that took huge hits. And so likely their giving will be down, whereas there are other corporations that really rose to the occasion. They were not hit as hard by the pandemic and the economic downturn. And so we'll see how the balance is when we look at 2020. And then lastly, foundations continue to grow from 2018 to 2019. And I think we're going to continue to see that in 2020 as foundations really stepped up in the pandemic. And some of that, foundations have grown pretty consistently over the last 20 years. And a lot of that has to do with market growth as well. And that there are now more foundations than there used to be. Where does the money go? Still, religion is number one, although that has dropped over the last 10 or 15 years. Education, oftentimes people are giving to their alma maters. Human services was up a tad, 2019 over 2018. Health is at about 9%. So, we're seeing pretty much similar trends to what we had seen before. Yeah, let's look at. So the next slide, I'm not going to read it to you, but what I want you to think about is that each one of these different types of foundations have a different way of giving and oftentimes different reasons for giving. So if you look at a community foundation, as Nikki discussed earlier, oftentimes community foundations are giving from donors, from special projects and funds, and from endowed funds. St. Louis Community Foundation has fewer endowed funds than many other community foundations. So you're seeing mostly from us, donor-driven and special projects. Private foundations, the trustees tend to be pretty thoughtful. They may not be as deeply engaged as you'll see with community foundation staff or family foundation. And they tend to be a little more dependent on staff. Family foundations, one of my dear friends that is the director of a family foundation here in town says her number one job is to make sure that the family still gets along at the Thanksgiving dinner table. So there are all sorts of other dynamics that go into family foundations. And as you're thinking about grant writing, that's something to remember. Family foundations also can pivot a little faster because trustees are typically family members, or there may be others there as well, which allows them to shift priorities, shift areas of funding more quickly. Some people call that the squirrel effect. Whatever I see is going to take my attention away, and that's can be exciting, and that can be difficult for nonprofits as well. And then when we think about corporate foundations, they're oftentimes they're looking at cause-related marketing. And so their grant initiatives oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes have to do with the areas that where their funds come from. So Centene does do some health funding, that kind of thing. Okay. Somebody asked about percentages matching St. Louis versus the United States. I am sorry, I didn't dig out those percentages for the US. I would imagine that we're not horribly far off. So in terms of individuals versus corporate and foundation giving. We may actually be a little lower in foundations because we have fewer large foundations in St. Louis. We only have, we think now, $2 billion foundations compared to many of our sister cities that might have 4 or 5. And so that really lowers the amount of discretionary dollars that are available. Okay, let's talk a little bit about grant writing. So the next little cartoon that we're sharing with you, I think is probably more true than you would ever believe. So you could say that since Nikki and I work with all these different foundations, that if you can figure out what Nikki likes and what I like when reading a grant application, then you've got it figured out. What I would say is that each one of those 13 that Nikki went through has a different purpose and a different oversight body. And our job is to make sure that those decision-making bodies get the information that they want and that they need to be able to make the decisions that they want. So we have to pay attention to what each one of them, or how each one of those different oversight bodies makes their decisions, just as you do. And we try to share that with you when we talk to people about the different foundations and trusts and initiatives that we staff. So what does all of this mean? What this really means is that what grant making is about is meeting individual and foundation interest and nonprofit need. And the grants happen where those two come together. And I would suggest it's not just nonprofit need, it is also community need, right? So we're looking for that sweet spot. We're looking for that place where the two come together. And again, this is, as we think about that nonprofit cycle from the the grant cycle from the nonprofit side, we really want to be thoughtful about how you all should be approaching this, not just how the funder is approaching this, right? So the first thing for you all to do is to really do your research. Think through who makes sense. So the question earlier about any grants for kids with special needs, that's the right question. Who is funding in the area of kids with special needs? You find those, and then you get to know those funders. Figure out who's behind this and what interests them. Build that relationship so that when they're thinking about, oh, I really want to pay attention to someone who's looking at early childhood education, that you're going to be the organization that pops into their minds, right? And that happens as you build those relationships. The other thing is, make sure you really know what you want to bring forward when you bring it forward. Make sure that that project or that program that you come to a funder with is really well conceived. We would rather that you, not apply for the first round if you're not ready, hold off, and really make sure it's a good pitch when you bring it forward, right? And when you do so, make sure that you're following the guidelines and the processes that that particular funder has put in place. There's nothing that makes people crankier than when you're trying to sort of fit your square hole into our round, or your square peg into our round hole, and saying, well, the guidelines don't exactly fit me, but here's why I think you should fund me anyway. There are too many organizations looking for funding for that to work anymore. I think maybe 20 years ago it did, but today not as much. If you're funded, thank the funder appropriately. And you all are really, really good at that. And here again, knowing and understanding who the funder is really helpful. Most institutional funders will say, don't give me a lot of swag. Spend that money on the programming or on your general operating support. I don't need a lot of stuff, right? But a lot of individual donors like this stuff. And a lot of family members and family foundations like this stuff. So, you got to kind of know who wants what and how to think appropriately. Does shift funder to funder. And if you're not funded, feel free to ask why not. Just this morning, Nikki and I received an email from someone who didn't receive a Jaffe Foundation grant and said, can we make an appointment to talk through what, why we didn't receive this funding? And our answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely, absolutely. We will have those conversations because we want you to be successful, and we want to be bringing forward good grant proposals to the trustees of and the donors. Communicate, provide updates throughout the process. You know, again, people like to know how things are going with the organizations they've invested in, and so you don't have to wait until the final report to send that update. And do send in the final report. I was talking a couple of weeks ago with one of my colleagues with another foundation, and she was saying she had asked probably 6 or 7 times to get the final report from a nonprofit and still hadn't received it. And she said, if they apply again, I'm not going to fund them. They didn't, you know, they not only did they not send in the final report, they didn't even respond to me when I asked for it. So there's a question in the chat about how funders identify their funding priorities. You know, how do you balance your organization's drive, mission, heart with and the community need with the fact that there aren't that many funders that are prioritizing your initiatives? You know, different funding bodies come to their priorities in different ways. For many private foundations, particularly foundations like the health conversion foundations, when nonprofit hospitals were sold to for-profit entities, all, you know, things like Missouri Foundation for Health and Deaconess Foundation, Lutheran Foundation are all health conversion foundations from the proceeds of those sales. And so some of it comes back to what the founding documents state for that foundation. Some of it is, some of those are real narrow in focus and some are very broad in focus. Most foundations will do some kind of a needs assessment. I should say most staffed foundations. Most family foundations, if they're large enough, might still do that needs assessment. If they're smaller, it might be what are the interest areas of the family members. It might be that a family member has, or a family started a foundation based on some event in their life, and that's how they set up the foundation and what they're going to provide funding for. But again, I think those that are being strategic look at needs assessments and what are the needs in the areas that that are set forth in their founding documents. Okay. And how are needs assessments executed? What information do they source? I do a 2-hour needs assessment workshop. So in the space of this conversation, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through that, but Ms. Chandler, or I'm sorry, Ms. Blank, if you want to give a call sometime, I'd be happy to talk through. Oftentimes they're looking at a wide variety of sources. There may be, for instance, with our Bridgeton Landfill Community Project Fund, we did 70 one-on-one or small group interviews. We did 4 or 5 focus groups. We held 4 community meetings, and we looked at countless source documents. So, so there's a lot, you know, there's a lot that goes into a needs assessment, and how those look by different funders can really vary. So, okay, and yes, Mr. Malone says, I'm hearing a good idea to research and fully understand your own project and need as well. I would completely concur with that, and our contact information will be offered up at the end. Okay, let's keep moving. So, program development and grant writing. This gets to what Mr. Malone just put into the chat. You know, I said previously, know what you want funded before approaching your funders. And that really starts with knowing who you're trying to work with, meaning that what clients or program participants or audience that you're looking at, and or community that you're trying to influence, and then knowing the need that you're trying to meet, being really clear about what it is you're trying to impact. And with that, what those outcomes that you want to have come out of that, outcomes that come out of this grant. You know, be concrete. What is the change that you want to occur, and who is it for? Within that, you know, there's a lot of conversation around evidence-based practice. We like evidence-based, but we also believe in promising practices or best practices. What we like to see is that there is some kind of research or understanding of this program, not that it was just something that sounded like a good idea, right? That there's a reason you're developing your program the way that you are. And sometimes you just have a really good idea. And if you're being innovative in that way, if you're thinking about trying something really new, make sure that you can clearly articulate why you think this innovation will be successful in ways that other programming has not. So, and then we look at that budget, and I can't say it enough, check, recheck, and recheck your budget. One of the trustees of one of the family foundations that we work with would go through that budget with a fine-tooth comb and say, what's this travel? I'm not sending anybody to Bermuda. And then you'd say, well, that's actually for, you know, the nurses to go and do home visits and the mileage for it. Oh, okay. Well, you know, what's this technology? I don't really want to fund technology. Well, that's it. And as long as the budget is solid and the budget justification gives the information that we need to be able to support that budget, then we can answer the questions, or the donors, the trustees can read and figure out those budgets themselves. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to do a pop quiz. So with everything that we've just said, what do you think funders are looking for in a grant program? And here are your 5 answers. Your understanding of the client, your strong needs assessment, your activities that are evidence-based or best practices or promising practices, outcomes or budget. What do you think? And Emily's setting up the poll.
For some reason, it says your polling session isn't active. Neosha, I don't know if you can see polls and launch it.
Here, I see it. I see it on my screen now.
Oh, can you click it? And then there should be a button that says launch poll.
Yes, and people are going.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, we're seeing, it's like a little horse race here. Best practices is still in the lead, but the needs assessment and the outcomes are kind of creeping up. Understanding of the client, budget, people think they're important, but not as important. We'll give it just a couple. We've got 88% of the people here have voted. Looks like we pretty much stopped. I think that's because probably there are a few of us that aren't going to vote. Okay, so the poll says program activities that are evidence-based with the needs assessment and outcomes shortly behind that. And then the clients and the budget, yeah, they're important, but not so much. Let's see what we think. The answer is, it depends on the funder. All of the above. Yes, Mark, you got it. So all of the above is probably the answer. And some funders are going to really look at one area or another. And as staff, when we have far more applications than dollars, we look at each area very, very carefully. We tend to pay more attention to sort of those logic model components or the program development components that were listed on the poll. And, you know, each of us has our own components of that grant that we pay a little more attention to. For me, community needs assessment is really important, and knowing that the program is a solid program is really, really important. For others, it might be something different. But the real story here are sometimes those intangibles. That sometimes it is some of those things that you just pick up from the grant. So for instance, Nikki will say, working with, you know, reading a grant application where you get the sense that someone's working with, not serving to, is really something that she pays attention to. Equity is becoming more of a focus for not just us as a foundation, but also for some of those that the funders and the foundations that we represent, where, you know, they're really wanting to see how are you bringing your client base or your audience base into your decision making. How are you thinking about equitable distribution or equitable programming? And there are some that, you know, they might have some real specific ideas, some funders that might have some real specific ideas that they want to see. So it might be geography. It might, like, I really want to fund in the city. It might be, I really want to fund this type of client. I look at the board list. I want to see who's on the board. Is it people that, you know, that seem like people I want to work with or I want to be associated with? You never know how, what will resonate at any given time with an individual funder or an individual donor, in particular with those individual donors and family foundations. Okay, let's go to poll number 2. So the application question is, what is your mission? And you've got a character limit of 3,000. Do you provide your well-crafted 1 or 2 line mission and move to the next question? Do you provide your mission and add your vision and values? Do you provide your mission and a little bit about how you implement that mission? Or do you provide your mission and you've got space, so by gum, I'm going to give them as much information about my organization as I can? So we'll launch this one. Okay, can people start clicking? I see it on my screen.
1 second, sorry.
No problem.
I have the first poll. Emily, do you have the first poll?
I think there's a, if you see the title at the top of the poll, there's like an arrow where you can click down.
Oh, I see.
There should be the second one.
There we go.
Sorry, technical issue.
Thanks. We got a horse race between A and B here. Mark, you're making me laugh today. Depends on the funder. If it's a federal funder, fill the page.
My dad is a nonprofit, and we joke that that the federal funding is the gift that keeps on costing. It really does.
They want you to fill that page count. You've got 2 pages, 2 pages it is.
There you go. Okay, I think we've kind of slowed down. Oh, nope, nope, still a few more coming in. Okay, I think we pretty much got it. So, provide your mission, add your vision and values comes in first, provide your well-crafted or 1 or 2 line mission and move to the next question. And then the other two a little less so. So let's see what we think. Okay, and for us, the answer is provide your well-crafted 1 or 2 line mission and move on to the next question, and maybe provide your mission and add your vision and values. And let me talk about this for a minute, and I'm going to tell a story, and Nikki's kind of tired of hearing this story. We get, for any given grant proposal, unless it's real narrow, we may get 40 or 50 grant applications. And many of those use the common grant application, or many of the programs that we run use the common grant application or some version of it. It might be slightly scaled down, or the common grant short version or something. And when you've got to read 40 to 50, and the common grant application takes you all the way through your logic model, right? Every component has a question. And if there's a whole bunch of extra stuff in any given question, that's a whole lot of extra reading that we have to do. And then later on, you're repeating it because the question gets asked later on. So when you've got 40 or 50 grant applications and you know you're going to read this stuff later on, what do you do with all that extra stuff after the mission is listed? You don't read it. So you're spending your time, we're spending our time, and it's not value add for you or for the reader. The vision and values, you can throw those in. You can throw those in, that's fine. We're not going to get cranky about it unless it gets asked later. If it's asked later, what's your vision or what's your values, don't put it in there twice, okay? And I'm going to tell the story of a real life grant application that we read, and I hope the person isn't here today. But in this, I finally called the person and said, what's your mission? You've got 7 paragraphs under the mission area. And then you've got later on, it says, well, our core mission is such and such, and it said something different. And, and then somewhere else you said to fulfill our mission to do X, Y, and Z that was different than the other 2. And I can't figure out what your mission is. That should be a really easy question to answer. And the person said, well, if I've got space, I'm going to fill it so that you can learn more about my organization. And what that did was that created confusion. Well, a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, I was, a dear friend of mine had posted something about, those darn funders who put all these really restrictive character limits into their grant applications. And why do they do that? Well, let me tell you why we do. It's because we get 3,000 characters when all we want is a 2-line mission, and we can't figure out what we're reading. So we need to give and take on the funder side. And what our ask of you is that you also be thoughtful about what the funder is really asking for and what the funder really needs to know. Okay, so that's my lecture for the day. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki.
We have another great cartoon. This is great. Like, I love this one because it's true. And in a lot of cases, I think this is a really good time to talk about my background. And I think that's important here because I'm a social worker by trade. So I come from nonprofit. I have done everything from scoop to nuts in nonprofit, from programming to grant writing. I mean, you know how that works. Like, one day you're writing a grant, the next day you're recoding the website. And I say that as a real world example. And I think that my experience has been really good in terms of being able to talk to nonprofits now about what we are looking for in grants and kind of seeing things on the other side. So I really like the perspective that I've gotten from both sides of this from this process. I think it's important to think about making the grant easier for the reader to review because for many reasons. In addition to Elizabeth and I only being a mighty team of 2 that read everything, our funders are reading these in most cases. In some cases where we have a huge board and, you have a doctor on the board and a hospital administrator with 3 kids under the age of 5, they may not read every single application if you're getting 40, but someone is reading every single application. And I think that's really important to put yourself in the perspective of who's reading that and the fact that they might be reading 40 or 50 of them. And you can tell your story in a concise way. The other thing I like to think about and kind of present this as in terms of our funders is really looking at this from the perspective of a business proposal. Like our funders who are reading these more than likely have been successful in business. I mean, or their family has, if they have established a foundation. And they know what they're looking for when they're looking to invest in something. And they are more than likely going to look at that from a very similar perspective for nonprofits and for-profits. And our funders are very mindful that nonprofit professionals are busy and they're not going to ask for more than they want. And I think that that's really important to think about too, is that they really think about this when they're crafting applications. Just the other day, Elizabeth and I added a question, a very, very mindful question at the behest of one of our funders to an application that really personalized it. And it was just one of those moments where we were like, this is what they were looking for. And they're only willing to ask just more than, just for a little bit more because this is important to them. So in sort of looking at this, like weaving your story of your organization, your community, and your services is important. For me, I really look at things from the perspective of how does this nonprofit operate from day to day? Coming from a nonprofit background, I'm a nonprofit nerd, and I want to know when your client walks in the door, what's the process? Like from beginning to end, like where's this client coming from? Who's referring these people? Who are your partners? What services are they receiving? Is their family receiving any services? Is there any referrals going on? There are ways to use the grant application to tell that story and do it very concisely. Again, answer the question that is asked and no more. I think that that's really important because I wasn't actually I'm from Illinois originally, and I've lived in New York, I've lived in Austin, and I've done nonprofit work everywhere. So I wasn't super familiar with the Missouri Common Grant application. I understand the process and the model and the logic behind it, but it wasn't the grant that I had written, in the past. But I think that as you are flowing through it, it really does make sense. If you're really carefully reading the question, it's like, this is all we're asking for. And I will say, I am that funder that is in the background setting those strict the limits, because I am the person that does all of the sort of background online work to set up the applications. And we do lock those down, because if we give 3,000 characters and don't really want it, then we'll get it. And it's funny because you look back at old applications that were, just sent by word, and they say 500 character limit. But that wasn't an issue. But now that we're, kind of locking it down to 3,500 words or characters rather, that can be an issue. If you feel like you're repeating information, then you are likely giving more information than you're being asked. I think that that's really important. And I think as a nonprofit professional, take that into consideration, because you're using your time as well, and your time might be better used elsewhere. And again, I understand as nonprofit professionals how much and how valuable your time can be. I joke, like I put out literal fires at my job. I have had my hand in a toilet more than once because something has gone awry, because that is, at the moment it comes and you have to react to those things. And I understand that. And if you're busy answering the same question 15 times in a grant application, you can't be doing those things that are going to help your community and your individual clients. Ensure that you're scaling your request to fit the funder. Never hesitate to reach out to us and say, what was the average last year? Or, what would be appropriate for this funder? In some cases, the application very specifically says that, but in some cases like EPHT, that kind of changes from year to year. We set, at the beginning of this year, we set a limit because we are mindful that we're going to get many applications. They want to fund as many organizations as they possibly can. And while we would love to, fund everybody's program in full, their approach is to sort of spread it out as much as possible. So, that's something that we, encourage you to ask us about if you're ever unsure. Ensure your proposal aligns with the mission and values of the funder as well as their current priorities. I think that this is so important because sometimes the priorities, again, of funders shift. That the pandemic was a great example of that. And I think that, Elizabeth and I talk a lot about how this idea of what basic needs are has shifted just within the past year. People are looking at computers and Wi-Fi access as a basic need, whereas a year ago, that vendor may have been like, I will never buy a computer, ever, ever, ever. I will not pay for Wi-Fi. It's not something that I support. Things change very quickly. So those priorities can change. But at the same time, while their mission and values stay the same. And I think that the Pettis Foundation is such a good example of that because it was established by a family member who is no longer here. And those, his legacy is wrapped up in this foundation. And there are both family members that are trustees and people that are not family members that are trustees. And I think that they both approach it with what was his intention? If he was here now, what would he like to see? And what were his values? And I think that that's very interesting because they're actually the organization that added that question, or the foundation that added that question to their application, which is, how are you reflecting our values? How is your work reflecting our values?
Hey, Nikki, we've only got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, so group writing. We definitely encourage people to take a group approach to writing if you can. Our system does allow you to do that very, very easily. If you have any questions about that, let us know. I think the most important pieces are that you assign somebody that is the leader. I joke that grants are like a dog. Someone has to own it. It's fine if everybody can play with it and feed it, but someone has to own it and be the leader. And then having those standard pieces that you are putting into grants each time, those boilerplate, those descriptions that are easy to sort of bring from place to place. And again, allowing that final edit to be a copy edit only. You've worked really hard to put this all together, and at the end, you're not sort of using it to the group to bring it all back and change everything, if that makes sense. Are there any questions about group writing? Sorry to rush through that. I know we have only a few minutes left. Okay, reporting on successful grants. This is important. Reporting is so important. I think it's important to note that funders will look at their reports to determine what the needs are of the community. That is a needs assessment in and of itself. And we will be looking, in some cases, because we have so much more capacity to look at statistics and look at data, some of our funders are looking at those things, all of their past giving, all of that past reporting, to sort of determine what their future looks like. So these are important. And I think that I want to stress that because I think some people will submit a report and think that nobody reads it. And that could not be further from the truth. We do read it. Many times our funders read them very carefully. And many times, again, they're used to create some sort of historical record. In terms of the reporting, we encourage you to be honest. Tell us what really happened. Be concrete. Consider your funder an investment partner. I think that's so important. We don't want the funder to seem like an authoritarian. We want them to be someone that is investing in the success of your organization, because that's exactly what they're doing. Don't wait till the report is due to approach the funder with any sort of program changes or budget variances. That's really important because in some cases they might not support that budget variance or that program change. And in some cases they would be in full support of it. So it is important to note that. Telling your story of how your community and your client and your organization has been impacted is so important. our funders love the story of what is happening and impact stories and individual stories. And again, updates between official reporting, those are welcome. If you'd like to send us, important updates via email that have those more qualitative things that are sometimes hard to measure in a report. I always say we don't make widgets. So sometimes it's really hard to, kind of tell that story of what you've made and what you've done with your clients. Okay, sorry to rush through those last two, but do we have any questions in the chat or otherwise?
Can you stop sharing your screen now just for a minute so we can see everyone, just in case? I would prefer if you put your questions in the chat, just because there are about 100 of you and I would have to scroll through everything, but just in case. So yeah, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
And I will be putting Nikki's and my contact information in the chat as well, so that we can take questions face to face.
There we go.
I'm surprised there's not more questions. Oh, no need to apologize. Grace and space in the pandemic for all things.
Well, if no one has any questions, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for staying for 1 minute extra. And I also want to thank our ASL interpreter for being with us today and helping us make this training as inclusive as possible. Our next training is March 25th with Marianne Dershigan, and you can register for that at givestlday.org/content/trainings, which I will put in the chat. Oh, it looks like we have one question. Is it appropriate to ask funders about mission match?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a question about mission match or even a specific project, let us know. We would absolutely welcome those questions. Oh, contact information.
Yeah,
If I put it in, I'll put it in again. Maybe I sent it to somebody that direct chatted me, so maybe I accidentally did that. Okay, I hope I spelled everything right there.
And the chat transcript and slides will be made available and sent out and posted in our Facebook group. So you will all have this information either by the end of the day today or tomorrow. But thank you all for joining us and have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.
I never can figure out how to leave.